Shashikiran to this August gathering. Of course, Sri Shashikiran is not unfamiliar to this dayas and even to this great pioneering institution. B.N. Shashikiran had his graduation from engineering college, which is next to our institution, well-known institution, that is BMS College of Engineering. Recently, he completed with flying colors in mechanical engineering. Throughout his career, he is a rank student, and apart from that, his deep interest and erudition in Sanskrit, especially in literature, poetry, and other aspects of language, is noteworthy and phenomenal. And recently, he entered into the course of Masters in Sanskrit, and presently he will be completing that master's degree also in Sanskrit aesthetics and literary criticism. B.N. Shashikiran has, to his credit, many research papers and articles both in engineering and in Sanskrit learning. He has written quite a few articles in the well-known internet journal Preksha, and presently he is working as the contributing editor to that journal. And his writings are spread out in Kannada, English and Sanskrit. All these languages he uses in a facile manner. His erudition and even the felicity of using these languages is really significant and noteworthy. And in him, I see a competent research scholar and a competent poet as well. His deep commitment for feeling and Indian culture is unforgettable. Apart from all these qualifications, he is well trained in the recitation of Rigveda under a great Ghanapati. So all these has put together a promising scholar in him who will be a proponent of Indian culture in future. I earnestly request Sri B.N. Shashikiran to present the masterly work of Kalidasa, Meghadoota. Meghadoota and Kalidasa, they need no introduction. And our speaker himself is adept in giving a beautiful introduction, not only introduction, an insightful understanding and a real rewarding, enjoyable poetic journey in the flying cloud flight, I can say. Something like an aircraft, much more than an aircraft, Pushpaka Vimana. He'll be giving that enthralling experience. And so I request Sri Shashikiran to carry out this talk for 3 days and make us know more about this wonderful lyrical poem. Why I think this is very unique? Because he is well trained in modern sciences and technology, and his language is really remarkable, and his understanding of the epic is, it's a lyric of course, but lyric of epic dimensions is really significant, and he has read all the works of Kalidasa. And so whatever he will be speaking on Kalidasa is not something picked up, it's all from the experience. That is very important. Many times what happens, the speakers, they'll be speaking about few verses of Kalidasa and that's all they'll be knowing. Some favorite things. Even I know great professors who have taught Kalidasa and other poets for years and years, decades and decades, they would have not even crossed 4 or 5 sargas of Kumara Sambhavam. The same thing, old wine in new bottle, which will be going on the same mill. But here is our friend who is not of that order. In that way, he'll be speaking from his experience, from his feeling and understanding, and experiential deliberation will always be rewarding, will always be welcoming. So I once again welcome Sri B.N. Shashikiran to this gathering, and I am deeply grateful to the organizers and also the sponsors of this program, and even to the listeners who have come from distances to appreciate this. Thank you. Welcome.
ॐ देवीं वाचमजनयन्त देवाः तां विश्वरूपाः पशवो वदन्ति सा नो मन्द्रेशमूर्जन्දුहाना धेनुर्वागस्मानुपसुष्टुतैतु दिक्कालाद्यनवच्छिन्नानन्तचिन्मात्रमूर्तये स्वानुभूत्येकमानाय नमः शान्ताय तेजसे कालिदासगिरां सारं कालिदासः सरस्वती चतुर्मुखोऽथवा साक्षाद्विदुर्नान्ये तु मादृशाः. सर्वेभ्यो नमः. Sarvebhyo Namaha. I feel really blessed and consider it a real honor to be invited to Gokhale Institute of Public Affairs to give a talk on Kalidasa's Meghadoota. It is because of multiple reasons. The foremost of them being, I have nothing but the highest respect for the founder of this institution, Dr. D.V. Gundappa. I worship him very ardently. I have been deeply influenced by his personality and his works. I also happen to consider him one of the guiding lights of my life. And I have no words for Shatabdhani Dr. R. Ganesh here. His friendship is something I deeply cherish, and it has really made, I have to say, my life worth living. Whatever I know about Indian culture and Sanskrit poetry in particular is without exception really due to him. So whatever I'm going to speak in the next 3 days will at best remain feeble shadows of his brilliant insights into Kavya. So to Dr. S.R. Ramaswamy, Nadoja Dr. S.R. Ramaswamy, to Sri Ramu, and of course to all the members of this institution, to Shatabdhani Dr. R. Ganesh, and to the organizers of this talk, to the members of Dr. P.N. Raghavan's family, I offer my heartfelt words of gratitude. Bhurisho dhanyavadaha. I feel I am unsuited for this talk because of many reasons. Firstly, because the subject of this talk itself is Mahakavi, our Rashtra Kavi, Kavikula Guru Kalidasa's Meghadoota, to the expanse of whose poetry I can claim to make no justice at all, whichever language I speak in. And also, I have been asked to speak in English, a language which itself does not yield very easily to give expression to the hallowed heritage of Sanskrit poetry, to the intricate and ornate expressions of Sanskrit poets. And also, of course, it is due to my unfamiliarity or lack of proficiency in the language. So I request you all to please bear with me. So at the very outset, I have given you a list of limitations of mine. And due to this, a question might arise in all of your minds: why should you listen to me at all? And as an answer to that, I will be using a verse from Kalidasa himself and alter its meaning ever so slightly. He says at the beginning of his Vikramurvashiyam, Pranaishu va dakshinyad athava sadvastu purusha bahumanat shrunata manobhiravahitaihi kriyamimam Kalidasasya. So he says, out of compassion or out of empathy for people in love, or out of respect, reverence and admiration for the topic and the things that are described in this work, you may all please lend an attentive ear to this work of Kalidasa, and not because of anything else. So before actually going to the actual subject matter of this talk, that is Kalidasa's Meghadoota, I think it will not be inappropriate for me to say a few things about the poet himself, about Kalidasa. And in doing so, I will not bore you by unwanted details about the poet. All of us here very well know that Kalidasa is the author of 7 works. He wrote 2 Mahakavyas, Raghuvamsha and Kumara Sambhava, 2 Khanda Kavyas or Laghu Kavyas, Ritusamhara and Meghadoota, and 3 Rupakas, Malavikagnimitram, Vikramorvashiyam and Abhignana Shakuntalam. And there have been lots of debates in scholarly circles regarding his time and the place in which he lived. But for our purpose, it would suffice to understand that he lived sometime around the 4th century in the Common Era, and his birthplace was probably Ujjaini, as we know it today. No other detail will really help us in appreciating Kalidasa's poetry better, so I won't go into any of that. But instead, what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is that talk about Kalidasa's uniqueness as a poet and his approach to poetry, give a brief outline, as it were, of what he thought was to be of value in poetry and what he thought was not of value in poetry. This also I intend to do to increase somehow our understanding and our appreciation of Kalidasa's poetry. First of all, as I indicated earlier, we do not have any authentic, reliable records historically to understand Kalidasa's personality. We do not have any of that. So all we have to get to know about Kalidasa are his works themselves, the 7 works. And of course, they have ample material in them for us to glean insights into his poetic abilities, into the mind which produced these 7 works. So upon a close reading of these works, what we understand is that, as I see it, Kalidasa's personality is best expressed by a verse of his in Abhignana Shakuntalam. In the 7th act of the work, when Dushyanta happens to go to the ashrama of Maricha Muni, he happens to see many sages who are performing tapas. Kalidasa says, he pens a very beautiful verse in that context. He says, Prananam anilena vritti ruchita satkalpa vrikshevane toye kanchana padmarenu kapishe punya abhisheka kriyaha or tirthabhisheka kriyaha or dharmabhisheka kriyaha. There happen to be some pathabedas in that context. Dhyanam ratnashilataleshu vibudha strisannidho sayyamaha yatkangshanti tapobhiranyamunayaha tasmim tapasyantyami. So what were these sages doing? They were engaged in pranayama, having seated beneath the wish-fulfilling tree, that is the Kalpavriksha. And they are performing their abhisheka, or they are having their ritual bath in the waters that were alit, that were aglow by the pollen grains of golden lotuses. And they are engaged in doing dhyana, having seated on pedestals that were made from the choicest of gems. And they maintain their bodily and mental composure even in the presence of divine damsels like Urvashi, Menaka, Rambha and so forth, whom we know are the subjects of extreme temptation. So what are these sages doing? They are already in a position, in a place which is the object of all penance. So what other sages wish to acquire, wish to accomplish by performing tapas, these sages are already in that position and still they continue to do tapas. Kalidasa was something like that. He could take any trivial, mundane object or an everyday happening and turn it into gold by means of his poetical ability. Such was the genius of Kalidasa. There is no object in this world which does not yield itself to evoke rasa. Dhananjaya says in his Dasharupaka, Ramyam Jugupsita Mudara Mathachi Athapinicha Mugram Prasadi Gahanam Vikrutancha Vastu Yadvapyavastu Kavi Bhavuka Bhavyamanam Tannasti Enna Rasabhavam Upaiti Loke. If at all some object is incapable of producing rasa, it is not the fault with the object itself, but the incapacity on the part of the poet to see through that object in its naturalness, in all its vibrant variety. So Kalidasa was a poet who could do that. And the scales of rasadhvani which he could effortlessly scale have proven to be insurmountable even to this day. we do not have any example of one more Kalidasa coming between us. We have only one example of Kalidasa. So that itself speaks volumes of his poetic skills. What D.V. Gundappa at one place terms as the twinfold objective of the hallmark of great literature. He says Ananda and Sat Prerane. These two things are the hallmarks of great literature, and Kalidasa provided both in ample measure in his works. By reading his works, one can gain enjoyment, and there is an inherent element of instruction also, which comes as a part of that enjoyment in Kalidasa's works. So he was a poet like that. In fact, while thinking of Kalidasa's personality, I cannot help thinking of his description of Shiva in Kumara Sambhava. Swayam vidhata tapasah phalanang kenapi kamena tapaschachara. Shiva is himself the fulfiller of all the desires that is there on earth, and he is himself engaged in tapas. What for? None of us know. What for? We cannot fathom the depths of personalities such as Shiva and Kalidasa. It is very much beyond us. So that is the poetical genius of Kalidasa. And in order to understand Kalidasa's position, his uniqueness in the history of Sanskrit literature, let us perform a small exercise. If we look into the development of Sanskrit literature, we see that on the one hand, they developed poetry in various modes of expression. There are Stotra Kavyas, Champu Kavyas, Gadya Kavya, Khanda Kavya, Mahakavya, Champu Kavya, and so forth. This is on the one hand. And on the other, they also developed a corpus of literature that was meant for the analysis of these kavyas. That is the Sahitya Shastra or Alankara Shastra as we term it. And in the development of this Alankara Shastra, there came people who belonged to various schools of thought. In the beginning, there were some people who thought alankaras or the figures of speech are they are the things that distinguish poetry from what is not poetry. So if we want to understand a general everyday expression from a poetical expression, those people thought it is the alankara which distinguishes the two. And even there in alankaras, they thought there are two modes of it, Shabda Alankara and Artha Alankara, and they gave more importance to Artha Alankara over Shabda Alankara. And even in that, they thought those figures of speech which stem from a sadrishya, which stem from similarity, those have greater efficacy and potency in bringing out poetical merit in a particular work. And in that sadrishya mula alankara, they thought upama is the greatest of all. Upama or the simile is the greatest of all. So in Alankar Prasthana, the upama is held to be a great alankara. And Kalidasa is described as having, great capacity to give expression to upama alankaras. As the very well-known saying goes, upama Kalidasasya. So if we, from the standpoint of Alankara Prasthana, Kalidasa is said to be the greatest poet. Next came a set of people who thought marga or riti is the essence of poetry. They thought style, which marks style is the poet, is a very famous saying, and they thought three constituent elements which are there in every poetry, ojas, prasada and madhurya, that is brilliance, lucidity and sweetness. These are the constituent elements of all poetry, and the style which emerges as the harmonious amalgamation of all these three things is called the Vaidarbhi Riti. That is said to be the best style to give expression in Sanskrit poetry. And Kalidasa is said to be a master of the Vaidarbhi Riti, of the Vaidarbhi style. Vaidarbha Giram Vasaha is Kalidasa's epithet. Next came a set of people who thought Vakrokti, or the oblique expression or indirect way of expressing things, is the essence of poetry. Kuntaka is said to be the foremost proponent of this school of thought. And if he wrote a work by name Vakrokti Jivita, if we look into that work, we see that he quotes from Kalidasa's works very extensively in order to both establish and bolster his arguments for Vakrokti Siddhanta. So that naturally implies that he thought Kalidasa's works have great room for Vakrokti, for expressing Vakrokti in them. And then there was also another set of people who thought Auchitya is everything in poetry. The appropriateness. Without Auchitya, none of these concepts make any sense at all. So there were some people who thought Auchitya is everything. And Kshemendra, who was a poet, he lived, a poet and a great scholar also, he lived sometime in the 11th century in present-day Kashmir. He wrote two works, one Auchitya Vichara Charcha and Kavikantha Bharana, which is a manual for all aspiring poets. In that he says, Pathet samastan kila Kalidasa krita prabandhan itihasa darshi. So what does Kshemendra mean here? He prescribes the complete works of Kalidasa as requisite reading material for everyone who wished to be poets. So unless one reads Kalidasa's works and understands the nuances of what goes around in poetry, one is not fit to be a poet at all. This is the dictum of Kshemendra. And next came the Dhvani Prasthana, of which Anandavardhana is the foremost exponent. He says in his Dhvanyaloka, Asmin ativichitra kavi parampara vahini samsare Kalidasa prabhrutayaha dvitra panchashava mahakavaya iti ganyante. He calls Kalidasa not just as Kavi, but he calls him Mahakavi. And he says, in the hallowed heritage of Sanskrit poetry, which has existed for thousands of years, we do not find even a handful of poets who are fit to be called Mahakavis like Kalidasa. So this is the great praise that Anandavardhana has showered on Kalidasa. And of course, the culmination of all these concepts is in rasa, is in the aesthetic relish or the aesthetic experience. And in bringing out rasa in any concept, as I indicated before, Kalidasa has no parallel. He is Raseshwarah Kalidasaha. So what do we understand by this? Going by the yardstick of any poetic concept, it remains true that Kalidasa is the acknowledged master. There is no parallel to him at all. And if this is the matter of scholars, there are also laymen, the consumers of poetry, who have nothing but genuine praise for Kalidasa. So much so that they have come up with multiple tales, multiple representations of themselves to make Kalidasa more intimate to them. They have internalized Kalidasa in such a manner that they have come up with multiple folklores of stories that have spun around the personality of Kalidasa. This is how a generation responds to a great poet, by bringing out stories, by internalizing the poet itself. The tradition responds to a great poet like that. So going by the yardstick of scholars or common connoisseurs of poetry, Kalidasa is a poet of acknowledged merit. And one more important thing about Kalidasa, what we notice in his poetry, is that he manages two things very beautifully. He does not miss the wood for the trees. He has an idea about the samashti, and also he has an idea about the vyashti. He manages the two of them very beautifully and in a very harmonious manner. In his works, we see a beautiful blend of darshana, that is philosophical insight, and kalpana, that is poetic imagination. Both of them are equally important to come up with a great work of art. Not a mediocre work of art, but a great work of art. There is a harmonious blend of darshana and kalpana. And also, we have a harmonious blend of varnana and the narration, that is kathana, of varnana and kathana. This is also very hard to achieve. Anybody who has attempted to write classical Sanskrit poetry would know this. If we look at Puranas or mediocre works in Sanskrit poetry, we are repeatedly bored by unwanted descriptions, unwanted narrations, time and again. So it is very difficult to have a blend of these two things. If we look at the Puranas, they have, narration upon narration. We have stories and stories, stories upon stories. That is how we can easily distinguish interpolations from the main text in actual great works. So Kalidasa manages the two very beautifully. And one more important thing about Kalidasa is, he does not remain unwanted for anyone. People can relate to him in their own way, irrespective of their class, their societal standing, or to whichever strata of society they belong. This is the hallmark of a great poet, of a great poetical work, in that it has so much room, it has so much accommodation within itself for people to relate to it in their own way. It does not impose itself on the readers, and it does not impose its ideas on the readers. It has no agenda to fulfill, but is there only to provide enjoyment, and still people can relate to it in their own ways. This is how, in fact, Ramayana and Mahabharata have survived to this day, and they continue to impress and appeal to us in so many manners. They have so much room for dhwani in them. So Kalidasa's works is like that. If a poet looks at Kalidasa's works, for example, there is so much to learn about the art of poesy in Kalidasa's works. We can look at his characters, that are the patras, prakarana, prabandha, his handling of meters, his usage of alankaras, how he uses words to bring about dhwani, and a host of other technical things for a poet to see and learn. And for an ordinary connoisseur, for a rasika, there is also ample material to enjoy. Kalidasa is known as a poet of Panchendriya Trupti. He appeals to all the 5 sense organs simultaneously. This is something which we do not witness in any other poet in this measure, in this quality and quantity as Kalidasa does. We do not see that happening in any other poet. So even for a common person, there is enough charvana samagri to last for a lifetime. And if we look at it from the standpoint of a scholar, if we look at Raghuvamsha alone, his epic poem Raghuvamsha, we see he was an adept scholar in so many shastras, of Dharma Shastra, of Jyotisha, of Vyakarana, Alankara, Chandas, of course, and so many other branches of learning. His was an ever active mind which grew, which had so much thirst for knowledge. So even it appeals to scholars also, and to the proponents of various arts, be it music, be it dance, be it sculpture, be it painting, whatever. Even there is ample material in Kalidasa's works for all of them to read and enjoy and learn. It will obviously enrich their works. So any person who is entering into the great world, into the beautiful world of Kalidasa's poetry, is sure to be enriched at the end of it. Nobody will come out empty-handed upon reading Kalidasa's works. This is the greatness of his poetry. And to speak of his style, Dr. M.R. Kale, in the introduction of his translation of Meghadoota, he has translated the text, gives a paragraph which succinctly summarizes Kalidasa's view of poetry. Dr. Kale says, Kalidasa's poetic genius has brought Sanskrit poetry to the highest level of elegance and refinement. His style is peculiarly pure and chaste. It has neither the laxity of the Puranas nor the extravagant coloring of the later poems. It is unartificial and characterized by brevity that is consistent with perspicuity. Kalidasa's writings are embellished with similes unparalleled in their beauty and appropriateness, and with pithy general sayings. His diction is marked by the absence of long compounds. In fact, Dr. A.R. Krishnashastri, in his exposition of Kalidasa in the beautiful text Samskrita Nataka, he says, there is not even a single word that is a long compound in the whole of Abhignana Shakuntala. This is the remark of A.R. Krishnashastri. So Dr. Kale continues, it is marked by the absence of long compounds, involved constructions, overwrought rhetoric and artificial puns. Kalidasa excels other poets in his description of the sublime and the beautiful, and especially of natural scenery and phenomena. His sentiment is neither abstruse nor profuse, but one which makes a direct, sympathetic appeal to the heart. And as regards Dhvani Kavya, the kind of poetry which suggests more than what is expressed, he is a master of acknowledged skill. So, Dr. Kale very beautifully describes Kalidasa's poetic genius. And one more thing about Kalidasa is that in his poetry, he comes up with these beautiful turns of phrases which are so much loaded and have so much of ideas in them that lesser poets, would have scattered those ideas in multiple verses. If a poet like me were to attempt writing like Kalidasa, I would write in 20 or 30 verses what Kalidasa has expressed in a single phrase. So that is the akripanata of ideas in Kalidasa, and that is what marks him out in the history of Sanskrit poetry. And his importance is also because he gave expression to everything that is best that India has to offer to the world. He completely internalized the entire civilizational ethos of the golden age of the Guptas and immortalized them in poetic form. In all of his 7 works, we see the Indian culture come alive. The vibrant beauty of Indian culture in all its dimensions, it comes alive in Kalidasa's works. So he is naturally regarded as our Rashtra Kavi. It should be a matter of immense pride and happiness to all of us to be able to just enjoy Kalidasa's poetry. Such is his efficacy, such is his influence on the world of letters. And at the same time, his works are not merely dry or didactic. What happens for a person who is embarking on a journey to say, describe some culture, to describe some essence of some culture, it is very easy for it to become dry. But Kalidasa's poetry is not like that at all. It is full with rasa. And his originality is something remarkable. We cannot even to begin to understand his originality. The very fact that he could conceive as great as poetic meters like Mandakranta, Drutavilambita and Rathodhata itself, gives him the distinction of a great darshanakara. In fact, if I am permitted to use the expression, because it is really, really difficult to conceive meters. And to conceive meters like Mandakranta, like Rathodhata, which are so beautiful in themselves, it takes a really great, a sensitive mind, and Kalidasa has done that. And we see him giving expression to so many things for the first time. For example, we do not have any historical account of the concept of dohada, which became a poetic convention and is so easily seen in the works of later poets. In Kalidasa's Meghadoota, I will dwell upon it later, he says, he gives the example of dohada of Ashoka and Bakula Vrikshas. And he describes a Swayamvara for the first time in ample detail in his Raghuvamsha. And he writes a set of very beautiful verses as Suprabhata Kavyas to wake up Aja in his Raghuvamsha. He comes up with a set of Suprabhata verses, which later evolved by itself into a tradition. And the meter which Kalidasa used, the Vasanta Tilaka, to describe the Suprabhata, even that became a tradition by itself. Later poets used it extensively. So whichever aspect of Sanskrit poetry or Indian culture we can think of, all that has found its beautiful expression in Kalidasa's works. To sum up, to give a picture about Kalidasa, I would like to quote Sri H.A. Vasuki here. He has authored a beautiful must-read monograph on Kalidasa, in which he says, Kalidasa advocates an austere but aggressive pursuit of prosperity and a moral but intense pursuit of desires. This is the best way one can sum up Kalidasa, I feel. And he is much like his description of Dilipa in his Raghuvamsha, Asaktas Sukhamanva Bhut. He enjoyed but never indulged. He was all for enjoyment, but it did not degenerate into addiction. That was what Kalidasa. And with these few words, now to come to the actual subject matter, that is Kalidasa's Meghadutam. It is termed a Khanda Kavya in terms of Indian poetics, and in Western parlance it is variously described as a lyric or an elegy, but the most popular description of it goes as a lyric. And in the Indian tradition, a Khanda Kavya, as the aestheticians expect it to be, has to have a single theme, and it has to be expressed in terms of a single meter. So the meter employed by Kalidasa in Meghadoota, as I told before, is Manda Akranta. Mandam Akranta iti Manda Akranta. I will talk about the appropriateness of using this particular meter for this poem in the later days to come. But Manda Akranta is a meter which has 17 syllables in one line. Na 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 na. This is the metrical rhythm of it. So Kalidasa has used this particular meter in the whole of the Khanda Kavya. And the description of it, the story of Kalidasa's Meghadoota is really straightforward. The story goes something like this. There is a yaksha, a superhuman, who is separated from his wife and banished for a year to live elsewhere by his master Kubera because he has transgressed in his duty. And so he comes to a place somewhere in central or the southern India by name Ramagiri, and he somehow manages to live for 8 months. And at the beginning of Ashadha, he sees a cloud looming by, and he thinks of it as a messenger that could deliver a message about his well-being to his beloved, who is there in Alaka Nagari. So he gives out his message, and this whole poem is there in 2 parts. The former part is called the Purva Megha, and the latter part is called the Uttara Megha. In the Purva Megha, the Yaksha describes to the cloud the route that it has to take in order to reach his house and in order to deliver the message to his wife. And in the Uttara Megha, we have a description of the Yaksha's wife and the Yaksha's house and the actual message itself, which comes at the end of the poem. So that is all there is to the story. Nothing extravagant. It is very simple. And what is the actual message that the Yaksha wants the cloud to deliver to his wife? He says at the end of this Meghadoota, Avyapanna kushalam abale pruchhati tvam viyuktaha. That is all there is to the message. He says the cloud is expected to tell the Yaksha's wife, your husband, though he is separated from you, is still alive, and he inquires after your well-being. That is all there is to the message. At first reading, this might appear very superficial. This has no appeal at all. He inquires after your well-being. Big deal. Anybody does that. But it is actually quite profound, because for people who are separated with their lovers, what they expect is a word of assurance, some reassurance that the beloved is alive, some pratyasha, some hope that they can somehow reach their beloved at some point in time. So a seemingly innocent, a seemingly innocuous message has so much of Dhvani Parampara in it. Kalidasa tells that, and it is the mark of Kalidasa's genius that he does not say whether the cloud actually makes the journey and delivers the message. We do not know that. Kalidasa does not say that. The poem ends by saying, okay, you have to go there and deliver the message. But we do not know. In fact, why I say this is the hallmark of great poetry, because it is absolutely immaterial for us to know whether the cloud actually made the journey and delivered the message. What is important, on the contrary, is that for us to know the intensity of emotions that have been portrayed in the work and their aesthetic appropriateness. One is the intensity of emotions and their aesthetic appropriateness, the auchitya and the manner in which they are expressed. So going by these 2 yardsticks, Kalidasa's work is really great. And so Meghadoota is a work of pure poetry. Why I say this is because if we look at the definition of a poet as expressed by Sanskrit rhetoricians, they say Varnana Nipunah Kavihi. A poet is one who can, describe all things very beautifully. And but for the Varnana aspect, the poet means absolutely nothing. And here in this Meghadutam, what Kalidasa describes in the Purva Megha is the Prakriti, is the geography. As I said before, Purva Megha is all about the path that is traced to be traced by the cloud. And here, Kalidasa makes use of nature in all its exuberant variety. He describes plants, trees, creepers, bushes, fruits, flowers, rivers, mountains. There is everything in it. We can have this description and, reconstruct the time, the geography of Kalidasa's time. It is so appropriate. So Kalidasa's love for his motherland is abundantly clear, is abundantly expressed in this Purva Megha. And over here, Kalidasa's love for motherland, which as I said, it soars high in imaginative skies, but still it is not untrue to reality. So much so that the path traced by the cloud is actually the path of a rain-bearing cloud that is propelled on by southwest monsoons in its movement from south to north. This is a scientifically established fact. So Kalidasa has actually observed the movement of clouds and given expression to it in a poetic form in his work. And that is how the cloud is able to take the message from Ramagiri, that is in central India, to Alaka, which is somewhere there in northern India in the lap of the Himalayas. So this is all about Prakriti. And in the latter half of the poem, that is the Uttara Megha, Kalidasa describes Manava Prakriti, that is the human nature. This is something Kalidasa enjoys doing. He juxtaposes Prakriti and Manava Prakriti with each other and shows us how the former can act as a stimulant, can act as an Uddipana Vibhava to the latter. Prakriti serving as an Uddipana Vibhava to Manava Prakriti. This we see in almost all his works. The entire fourth act of Kalidasa's Vikramorvashiyam is full of this. And we see examples of this in all his works. And there are also many unique features of Meghadoota as a lyrical poem. Of them, 3 strike to me as most significant. First of all, it was a new genre of poetry which was unexplored till then, which is the Khanda Kavya. So Kalidasa chose to write in a genre of poetry that was not at all present till that time. So he had to come up with the form of poetic creation by himself. And 2, it is the theme of poetry, that is the Duta Kavya or Sandesha Kavya, which was even till then unexplored. Nobody had written a Duta Kavya till then. Kalidasa chose to write a Duta Kavya. And 3, it is the poetic meter. It is Mandakranta, which is also of Kalidasa's own creation, which is also new to the world of letters. So all these 3 things put together secure for Meghadoota a unique place in the world of letters. And this Sandesha Kavya, it became so popular that it inaugurated a whole tradition of Sandesha Kavyas in Sanskrit poetry. In fact, there have been imitations, though they don't match up to Kalidasa's genius in any way possible. There have been multiple imitations of Kalidasa's Meghadutam in almost every regional language of India, and in Sanskrit alone there are multiple works. There is the Cheto Duta, Mruganka Duta, Hamsa Sandesha, Kokila Sandesha, Shuka Duta, Kaka Duta, Pavana Duta, Chakravaka Duta, and the list goes on. And even Dr. Ganesh here has written a satirical work called Dhuma Duta in Kannada. So the tradition of Sandesha Kavyas continues to have its influence even to our time. And this work is also unique in a manner that it enjoys the rare distinction of being a work with more than 50 commentaries. Imagine a work having more than 50 commentaries. This is a great distinction for any work in any language written in any part of the world. In fact, Dr. N. Parameshwara Unni, in his remarkable treatise on the Megha Sandesha of Kalidasa, lists as many as 63 commentaries, which are found till this date, which try to bring out the various nuances of Kalidasa's Megha Sandesha that he has found till date. And Meghadoota is also unique because it influenced a kavya which was based on a mode of literary creation called Samasya Purana. There lived a poet, a Jaina poet by name Parshvanatha, somewhere by name Jinasena, by name Jinasena, who wrote a poem by name Parshvanatha Abhyudaya, which is a kavya in 4 sargas. It is a Shantarasa Pratana kavya. So how does this connect with Meghadoota at all? Jinasena in that work takes one stanza from Kalidasa's Meghadutam and writes 3 lines of his own to explain the exploits of Parshvanatha, and he completes an independent kavya by itself in 4 cantos. So this is also called as an Aveshtana kavya. So Meghadoota, no other work has inspired such a work of Samasya Purti like Meghadoota. So it is also unique because of that. And if we look at the work itself, it has about 115 verses in total. A critical edition would yield about 110 verses. And this is, of course, a critical edition means that it does not include the interpolations of the work. And in fact, here, Meghadutam has a good number of interpolations in it. And what does this mean? Interpolation is directly proportional to the popularity of the work. No poet, whatever be his poetical merit, would want to interpolate his verses in a work that is unpopular. That would, go unheard, unsung by any people. So if a work is popular, then it makes sense to interpolate his own poet's own verses in that. So the very fact that Meghadutam has a good number of interpolated verses itself speaks volumes of its popularity. And the title of the poem is Megha Sandesha or Meghadutam. Both versions exist. Meghadutam is the more popular version. We see there is the Megha, the cloud, which Kalidasa has chosen to be the messenger. And if we look at the structure of Meghadoota, we see that the first 5 poems, the first 5 verses, they are expressed by the poet, by Kalidasa, as Kavi Praudhokti, in the sense that the poet speaks directly to us. He sets the context of the whole poem and leaves it to the yaksha to carry it forward. And the next 110 verses are all the words of yaksha expressing his thoughts to the cloud. In the first half, he describes the path, and in the next part, he explains about his wife and his house and so on and so forth. Here, in the yaksha's words, we see, barring a couple of verses, there is not even a single verse that does not have reference to the cloud. So here, multiple references to the clouds have been made in every single verse. This is really difficult to achieve because it is not a dry reference to the cloud in some manner of accountancy. Well, the cloud has to come in every single verse. Kalidasa does not do to establish that. But in fact, he brings it in a very artistic manner. So if we see why Kalidasa has chosen the cloud itself to be the messenger, Dr. Ganesh remarks whenever he speaks of Kalidasa that the lock is here given to the thief. The cloud, as we all know, is said to cause distress to people in love. So if the cloud is itself asked to be the messenger, it can really cause no harm, because the Yaksha speaks of the cloud in endearing terms, and he ensures the comfort of the cloud on its journey. So it can really cause no harm. So the lock is given to the thief, and Dr. Ganesh himself gives another parallel to explain this. He says the most mischievous boy in the class has to be made the leader of the class. So the menace is taken care of by itself. So that is how Kalidasa goes about doing it. And there is also an added layer of auchitya in choosing the cloud, because clouds, as we all know, are shape-shifting. They can assume any form. In fact, at the very beginning, the Yaksha describes the cloud as Janamitvam Prakriti Purusham Kamarupam Maghonaha. He calls it as Kamarupa, meaning to say it can assume any form at will. What does this say? This is, this I think is very much like Kalidasa's Pratibha. Kalidasa's Pratibha alone, which shines forth every moment, brimming with new ideas every moment. So the cloud itself can be likened to Kalidasa's Pratibha. And as I said before, a reference is made to the cloud in every verse of the Meghadoota. And in that we see it wears different hats in each verse. On the one hand, we see it acting as a friend of the mountains, as a beloved of the rivers, as resembling Krishna because of its blue-hued body, decorated with the peacock feathers, when the cloud is adorned with the rainbow. So when the cloud is adorned with the rainbow, Kalidasa says, Gopaveshasya Vishnoho. That is what Kalidasa says. The cloud resembles Krishna with the peacock feathers on his head. And also he goes on to say, the cloud, when it proceeds to the Himalayas, it has to assume the form of a flight of stairs for Parvati to step on when she is having an evening stroll with her beloved Shiva in the rocky terrains of Himalayas. So what more a thing, whether it is animate or inanimate, what better dhanyata can it expect than to be touched by the divine feet of the mother herself? So the cloud has this unique distinction as serving as a flight of stairs for that, and it also has the duty of being the messenger to the Yaksha. So it performs all these roles very well. So the Kamarupatva of the cloud is very well established in the course of this poem. And also Kalidasa does not stop at that. He gives us one more reason for choosing the cloud. Of course, going by his argument, as said here, it can be suited for anything. Anything can be a messenger going by that. But however, he says, Kamarta hi prakriti kripanas chetana chetaneshu. For people who are afflicted by love, they lose all sense of discrimination. They lose all sense of discretion. They can no longer differentiate between an animate and inanimate thing. So the Yaksha, who was so much in pangs of separation, he could not distinguish from an animate or inanimate thing. We could easily ask, the cloud, does it have in it to take the message of the Yaksha or to, understand emotions? How can a thing which is not endowed with emotions itself, how can it take the, message of Yaksha? DVG, I am reminded, he writes very beautifully in one of his forewords to N. Ranganatha Sharma's translations of Valmiki Ramayana. He says, people who ask such questions, ಅವ್ರ ಅಕೌಂಟೆನ್ಸಿ ಪರೀಕ್ಷೆಗೆ ಹೋಗಬೇಕು, ಕಾವ್ಯ ವ್ಯಾಸಂಗಕ್ಕೆ ಬರಬಾರ್ದು ಅಂತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಕಾಳಿದಾಸನ ಮೇಘದೂತದಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ಮೇಘಕ್ಕೆ ಒಂದು ಭಾವನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋ ಶಕ್ತಿ ಇದೆಯಾ ಇಲ್ವಾ, ಈ ರೀತಿ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಕೇಳೋರು ಅಕೌಂಟೆನ್ಸಿ ಪರೀಕ್ಷೆಗೆ ಹೋಗಬೇಕು, ಕಾವ್ಯ ವ್ಯಾಸಂಗಕ್ಕೆ ಬರಬಾರ್ದು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ದಟ್ ವುಡ್ ಬಿ ಎ ವೆರಿ ಆಪ್ಟ್ ಜಸ್ಟಿಫಿಕೇಶನ್ ಆಫ್ ಯೂಸಿಂಗ್ ದ ಕ್ಲೌಡ್ ಆಸ್ ದ ಮೆಸೆಂಜರ್. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಆಸ್ ಐ ಸಿ ಇಟ್, the whole Kavya, the whole Meghadoota is really symbolic of Dharma Viruddha Kama. Dharma Viruddha Kama is not something fancy. It is very dear and it is very intimate to all of us. It just means enjoyment, one's own enjoyment, that does not hamper in any way or does not come in the way of other person's enjoyment. That is all there is to it. It is enjoyment that does not degenerate into addiction. That is Dharma Aviruddha Kama. So, why is this important? How does this help us in any way to understand Kalidasa's Meghadutam? Here we see Kalidasa, he does not put down enjoyment as many of our traditionalists do. They say, being happy is not something good. We have been repeatedly taught to keep a straight face, to not laugh, to not express ourselves very freely in the presence of gatherings. Kalidasa does not do that. He does not demean or denigrate or put down enjoyment in any way. That is Kama, he holds Kama in very high esteem. And at the same time, he does not romanticize Dharma either. This is a very difficult balance to find. So, he does not get preachy at any time. It is very easy for people who speak of Dharma to speak in preachy tones. That immediately puts off the listeners as, it is just preachy, it does not make any sense. Kalidasa does not do that. Instead, what he does is, if a system is functioning harmoniously, that means it has some inherent dharma to it. And it should not be made explicit. It has to be realized by each and every single person on his own. This is Kalidasa's way of going about explaining Dharma. In Meghadoota, he describes two cities. One is the Alaka and one is Ujjaini as Bhoga Bhumis. In fact, in Alaka, we see almost a surreal description of the city, which is really hard to believe. He says, in Alaka Nagari, the women are all fair and all people are in the stage of youth throughout their lives, and all 6 seasons, the Rutus, they exist simultaneously, and the skyscrapers of the buildings, the skyscrapers in that land are studded with precious gems, and the gardens are always filled with ever fragrant flowers. So it is a sign of happiness, it is a sign of enjoyment there. But even in the midst of such enjoyment, the people there are not lewd, they are not, they are not crude in any manner, they are not ill-mannered. On the other hand, on the contrary, they are people of taste and refinement. And even while describing this, even while describing the Alaka Nagari in its exuberance, Kalidasa does not forget to mention Bahyodhyana sthira harashiras chandrika dhuta harmyaha. He says, the Mahakala, Ishvara, Shiva himself stands eternally on the gardens of the Alaka Nagari, and the moon, the crescent moon that is there on Shiva's head, it lights up, it radiates the entire city for all days to come. So, DVG terms this as Bhagavat Samakshata Abhyasa. He says, experiencing the proximity of the divine everywhere, and this is what ensures enjoyment does not degenerate into addiction. This is what Kalidasa does. And this is not a one-off happening in Meghadoota. This is not about Alaka Nagari alone. Even in the description of Ujjaini, he says, Dhama Chandishwarasya. That is how Kalidasa describes Ujjaini. And, this is a constant feature in Kalidasa's Meghadutam, right from the very first verse. He says, Kaschit kanta virahaguruna swadhikarat pramattaha shapen astangamita mahima varshabhogyena bhartuhu yakshashchakre janakatanayastana punyodakeshu snigdhachaya tarushu vasatim ramagiriyashrameshu. So he says janakatanayastana punyodakeshu, the place in which the yaksha chooses to reside is a place, the Ramagiri, whose waters have been purified on account of Sita bathing in them. So that is how he describes the Ramagiri. And when the cloud moves forward, he says, on viewing a mountain, he says, Raghupati Padair Ankitam Mekhalasu, the mountain whose slopes are dotted by the divine footprints of Rama. So, these sort of references are found aplenty throughout the work. So, by all this, Kalidasa suggests to us that even when the Yaksha is experiencing deep sorrow because of separation from his beloved, he has so much accommodation for the cloud. And also to be noticed here that, the Yaksha was banished from his master Kubera. The Kubera did not order the Yaksha to go to one particular place. The decision, the freedom to go anywhere rested with Yaksha. He could have as well gone to a prostitute colony. But he did not. He waited to be united with his beloved. He waited for 8 months. And after, upon seeing the cloud, he realized that it could serve as a messenger and thought, this is very beautifully expressed in Meghadoota. He says that the cloud, even before describing the path, the journey to be taken by the cloud, he ensures that the cloud won't be deserted, won't be left to itself in the path. He says the whole nature will come to your help on your journey. That is how Kalidasa says. And I mentioned about the Sita and Rama. And in this connection, I also have to make a point which many commentators mention. In fact, Kolachala Mallinatha Suri, who is one of the foremost commentators of all the Panchamahakavyas, he has written commentaries for Maga Shishupala Vadha, Sriharsha's Naishadhiya Charita, Kalidasa's Raghumsha and Kumar Sambhava, and also for this Khanda Kavya, that is Meghadoota. He says in his commentary Sanjeevini that Kalidasa derived inspiration to write this Meghadoota by reading the Ramayana. He says, Sita Vishaye Ramasya Hanumat Sandesham Manasi Nidhaya Rachitavan. That is how Mallinatha describes. So, all of us know the story of Ramayana where Hanuman was expected to act as a messenger between Rama and Sita. So, Mallinatha says Kalidasa gained inspiration to write his Meghadoota from that. But be that as it may, we do not know whether it is true or not. Even if it is true, it is only it is something very trivial in light of Kalidasa's genius. In fact, I can say Kalidasa has taken a single grain of rice and converted into a delectable 3-course meal. That is what Kalidasa has done. If at all he has gained inspiration from the Valmiki Ramayana. And as I said before, because of the refinement the Yaksha has undergone, because of the Vipralambha Sringara that he has repeatedly experienced while residing in Ramagiri, he does not curtail the joy of his messenger in any way. He says, in fact, while parting with the cloud, he says, Mabhudevam kshanamapi sakhe vidyuta viprayogaha. Cloud, you have helped me in numerous ways. I was afflicted with misery, with separation from my beloved. You came as a helping hand to me. May you never be separated from your beloved, that is the lightning. So the cloud and lightning are taken to be husband and wife, are taken to be beloveds of each other in our literary tradition. And the Yaksha says, though he himself is separated from his wife, he has the accommodation, he has the depth of feeling to acknowledge that love in its purest form exists for everyone. And so he has developed that refinement and says, Mabhudevam kshanamapi sakhe vidyuta viprayogaha. And even before describing, if we see, let us think of ourselves as the Yaksha. Whenever the idea comes to our mind that we see somebody who has the potential to do some work for us, what would we immediately do? We would immediately rush in with all details about the task. But Yaksha does not do that. He saves the message for the very end of the poem. In fact, even before describing the path to be taken by the cloud, he says, Khinna shikarishu padam yasya gantasi yatra kshinaha parilaghupayam srotasam chopabhujya. Payasrotasam chopabhujya. he says, you won't be deserted in your journey. In the path of, while you are progressing on your journey, if you get tired, you can rest on mountains. There are multiple mountains that are waiting to welcome you in your path. You can rest for a while there and, experience the pleasure of their company and move forward. And again, when you are going, you are expected to shower rains, right? After all, a cloud is expected to do that. It is its job. So whenever it, parts with its showers, it grows thin, it grows feeble. So whenever that happens, it can drink deeply from the waters of various rivers, which are also very welcoming for the cloud. They double up as the cloud's beloveds. Since the cloud takes water from the rivers, in the Sanskrit literary tradition or anywhere it is common sense, the rivers are taken to be various nayikas for the cloud, which is the Nayaka. In fact, Kalidasa describes various rivers in the course of the cloud's path to be, Nayakas in different moods. We see one river as a Proshitapathika, as a Vipralabdha, as an Abhisarika, in so many moods. We will see that in the course of this talk. And he describes so many mountains and so many rivers. For example, he says, in the path to be taken by the cloud, birds on their own accord are willing to help you. He says, Vamaschayam nadati madhuram chatakaste sakandhaha. The chataka bird will be sounding sweet melodies while flying beside you, and you will always be in pleasurable company. What would one expect to do when one is tired? We will listen to some soothing music. So Chataka there, by coming out with sweet melodies all through the journey, ensures that the cloud is well entertained. And he says, Garbhadana kshanaparichayan nuna mabadhamalaha sevishyante nayana subhagam ke bhavantam balakaha. There is another bird, the balaka, that is the cranes, which, they form a circle, an array of sorts around the cloud. In the Sanskrit literary tradition, it is believed that the cloud is what bestows progeny to the balaka birds. So in a time where the balaka birds would conceive, they would be very happy on the sight of a cloud, and they would be all excited, and they would circle the cloud and accompany it all through its journey. So there are the Chataka birds, there are the balakas, there are the Rajahamsas, which would accompany it till the Himalayas. He says, Akailasad bisakisalayat cheda patheyavantaha samupatyante nabhasi bhavato Rajahamsas sahayaha. There are the royal swans which would accompany you till Himalaya. So there is not even a single moment in the path of your journey where you will be deserted, left to you, left to go by yourself. And not just that, he says, Sarangaste jalalavamuchaha suchayishyanti margam. And he says, there are so many birds. He talks about the Rajahamsas in the same vein as he talks about a crow. So he says, Nidarambhai grahabalabujam akula grama chaityaha. In the city of Ujjaini, in the city of Dasharna, we see description of crows, which are popularly believed to cause all sorts of menaces. Kalidasa describes the crows in the same breath, in the same familiarity, with the same love, and with the same depth of affection as he does to Rajahamsas. So this is the Samanvaya Drishti, the prajna of a great poet, of a Mahakavi. And his poetic genius is so much so that he has so much attention to detail that he speaks of as many as 3 types of peacocks. 3 types of peacocks are mentioned by Kalidasa. One, he says, Shukla Pangai Sajala Nayane Swagati Kritya Kekaha. That is one type of peacocks. Then he progresses to describe Bandhu Pritya Bhavanashikibihi Datta Nuttopaharaha. And then he says, Dhauta Pangam Harashira Rucha Pavakestam Mayuram. So in these multiple forms of birds, which none of us will spare a moment to acknowledge their identity or very existence, Kalidasa has so much accommodation for each of them. And this makes more sense when we understand this as Yaksha's words. It is the Yaksha speaking all these words. He really wants the cloud to just take the message from one point A to point B. But he does not just narrate that. He brings in all of this. He brings in various forms of birds, and there are the various rivers. There is the Narmada. He says, Revam drakshas yupala vishamam vindhyapade vishirnam bhaktichhedairiva virachitam bhuti mange gajasya. So the Narmada, which is there in the foothills, which is flowing in the foots of the Vindhya mountains, you might have a look at her. And there are multiple other rivers from whom you can drink and feel all chuffed up again, get re-energized, revitalized, reinvigorated, and then progress on your journey again. There is the Vetravati, there is the Nirvindhya, there is the Shipra, there is the Gandhavati, there is the Gambhira, there is the Charmanvati, there is the Saraswati, there is the Ganga. So there is the whole of the Indian subcontinent which comes alive in Kalidasa's works. Just see, and the uniqueness of Meghadoota is that there are two things whenever we want to establish a causal relationship. One is the time and the other is the space. One is the Desha and the other is the Kala. Here in Meghadutam, Kala is kept constant. So it is the Varsha Kala, and the space keeps changing because the cloud has to travel from one point to the other. So by making the cloud travel in so many places, Kalidasa is actually giving us an intimate description of India that existed in his times. He does not go on to write a textbook of geography. That could have served his purpose well. But instead, he brings in all those details and incorporates all those details very beautifully in a poetic form in his work. And that was about the rivers, and there are a whole lots of flowers, shrubs, creepers that Kalidasa describes. He says, just imagine, if you think of a poet, if he wants to choose a flower, if he wants to choose some part of nature to be worthy of his description, what would he naturally mean? He would either choose a rose or a jasmine or some such thing. Or if it is a fruit, he would choose the mango or the jackfruit depending on his taste. But what Kalidasa does here, he describes a mushroom. Kalidasa describes a mushroom in Meghadutam. He says, Uchchilindhram avandhyam, and he gives such a high status to as trivial as a thing as mushroom. He says, you are the cause to make Mother Earth have progeny. When the first rains come, it is the mushrooms which, first take their birth. And they are seen everywhere. And by that, nin bhumiyan banje madodak bittilla. That is what Kalidasa says. So, Uchchilindhram avandhyam, prasavinim bhumim, Uchchilindhram avandhyam is what Kalidasa says. And that is about the mushrooms. And he does not stop at the description of such a seemingly petty entity. He also goes on to describe many flowers. He says, Ketakai suchi bhinnaihi, and Praudhapushpai kadambaihi. And he says, there is the Nichula, there is the Kandali, there is the Kadamba, Utpala, Kamala, Vanira, Devadaru, Kichaka, Lodhra, Ashoka, Bakula, Kunda, Kuravaka, Shirisha, Mandara, Kadali, Madhavi. But for Kalidasa's works, I would have personally not known there exist so many varieties of fruits and flowers. So, at the same time, it is both instructive and enjoyable, as I said before. Kalidasa gives us so many intimate pen pictures of all these things in the course of his explanation in the Meghadutam. And we might as well go into the actual poem, starting from the first verse. In this course of talks, I would focus more on the Purva Megha, that is the description of nature, rather than the Uttara Megha. I will pick only a handful of verses from Uttara Megha and render it before you. So, The first verse, I recited the first verse just a few moments ago. Kaschit kanta virahaguruna swadhikarat pramattaha. So the yaksha is not given an identity here. It is kaschit yakshaha, some yaksha, and it is kachit kanta. In fact, this kaschit kanta virahaguruna swadhikarat pramattaha, this has an interesting story to it. There is an interesting aside, if I may mention. This actually came to be a Laukika Nyaya by itself. It is called the Kaschit Kanta Nyaya. Kalidasa's verses, especially in Meghadoota, have some amount of Anvaya Klesha to it. So he says, Kaschit Kanta Viraha Guruna. While speaking of the Yaksha who is separated from the beloved, he says, Kanta Viraha Guruna. First comes the word Kaschit and next comes the word Kanta. So Kanta is a word of the feminine gender, and so it has to have an adjective in the same gender. That is the Sanskrit grammatical rule. It really has to be Kachit Kanta. But here Kalidasa has written Kaschit Kanta Virahaguruna. So some people, without reading the entire verse, just by reading Kaschit Kanta Virahaguruna, mistake it as, Kalidasa has actually has performed a grammatical mistake here. But of course it is not like that. It is referring Kaschit Yakshaha. He says Yakshas Chakre, which is there in the third pada. We have to have that Anvaya like that. So the Yaksha is not at all given an identity. What does this signify? That by having the Yaksha as a pretext, Kalidasa has described the love in separation as an entity which is there to all of us to experience. It can be experienced by all of us. If Kalidasa were to write by having for its subject some historical character, we will be so much lost in the characterization of that particular patra that we will not be able to appreciate the very bhava, the crux of it. The Vipralambha Shrungara might have been lost on the readers. If Kalidasa were to have a historical character, a popular character, he does not do that. He says Kaschit Kanta Viraha Kuruna. And the very structural beauty of this verse is so beautiful that he says Swadhikarat Pramattaha. There is a hint of Papa Prajna here because the Yaksha has transgressed in his duty. Various commentators give various accounts of this transgression. The most popular one being the Yaksha's duty as a subordinate of Kubera was to supply flowers as Kubera performed his daily puja to Mahadeva, and on one particular morning Yaksha was expected to give him flowers like every day, but he did not. He was at his home with his wife enjoying an intimate moment, so he lost track of time and he did not go. And obviously Kubera grew furious and he cursed the Yaksha to go elsewhere. He banished the Yaksha to be separated from his wife. So there is this element of Papa Prajna in Kalidasa saying Swadhikarat Pramattaha. But as I said before, in the next line or in the line after that, he says Janakatanaya Snana Punyodakeshu. Says there is the element of punya also. So Kalidasa does this very beautifully in multiple occasions in Meghadoota. He brings in two concepts which are seemingly opposite, which are seemingly irreconcilable, but they have an underlying unity to them. Unity is the undergrid which holds together all these seemingly disparate concepts. So Shapena Astangamita Mahima Varshabhogyena Bhartuhu Snigdhachaya Tarushu Vasatim Ramagiri Ashrameshu. So by using a Bahuvachana in Ramagiri Ashrameshu, he says not Ramagiri Ashrame, but Ramagiri Ashrameshu, Kalidasa is indicating the state of mind of a person that is afflicted by love. He cannot stay in one place. He cannot sit in one place and meditate because the thought of its beloved just simply ceases to go away from there. And if at all he has to sustain himself, it is very difficult to be engrossed in that thought all the time. It will render you mad. So you have to engage yourself in some sort of an activity in order to sustain your life. So so what the Yaksha is doing, he is moving about from place to place in the Ramagiri ashramas. So that is what Kalidasa is trying to portray here. And in the next verse he says, Tasmin nadro katijid abala viprayukta sakami nitva masan kanaka valaya bhramsha rikta prakoshtha ashadhasya prathama divase megham ashlishta sanum vaprakrida parinatagaja prekshaniyam dadarsha. So when I mentioned that the cloud is shape shifting, it can assume any form. I forgot to mention one thing, that it also can take the form of an elephant. So when the Yaksha sees the cloud, he looks at it as an elephant. He confuses it for an elephant which is playing on the slopes of some mountains. Yaksha vaprakrida parinatagaja prekshaniyam dadarsha. So that he sees the cloud, and what was the Yaksha like? He had grown so emaciated on account of longing, on account of pining for his beloved, that he had grown so thin by that time, after 8 months of agony, that his hands were empty. Yaksha was an attendant of Kubera himself. Kubera is the lord of wealth, and he stays in Alakapuri, which is the land of the abundant, most abundant material prosperity. And Yaksha was a person who was a personal attendant of Kubera. So by all this we can imagine the sort of richness that Yaksha was in. And here he does not even have a single ornament on his body. Even the bracelet which was adorning his his wrist had fallen off on its own accord, because he had grown so thin. While he grew separated from his beloved 8 months before, his arms were full of muscles, and that bracelet was a beautiful ornament on his wrist. And by this time he has grown so thin that he does not even realize. There is this significance. This is not Yaksha speaking. Yaksha does not say, "Oh, my bracelet has slipped off." It is Kalidasa talking to us. Kalidasa says the bracelet has slipped off by itself. He describes the Yaksha as Kanaka Valaya Bhramsha Rikta Prakoshtha. In fact, in the whole of Purva Megha, we do not see any display of material extravagance. It is the display of emotions that is there in all their rich variety. That is what appeals to us because of their rich descriptions. And when does the Yaksha sees this? Ashadhasya Prathama Divase. Kalidasa mentions only 2 tithis, 2 dates in the whole of his literature, both in Meghadoota. One he says Ashadhasya Prathama Divase, and he says when you have to deliver the message, the date is Bhujagashayana Utthite Sharangapano, that is on the day of Utthana Dwadashi. He mentioned those 2 dates. So the date of Utthana Dwadashi is used by people of later generations, even it continues as a tradition to this day, as commemorating Kalidasa Jayanti. And Ashadhasya Prathama Divase has a very beautiful literary significance to it. In fact, there are many. It forms an occasion to mark the greatness of Kalidasa, to remember Kalidasa and his works. And some friends, Dr. Ganesh and some friends, always exchange letters on the Ashadhasya Prathama Divase. So it is a very beautiful way to remember Kalidasa and his works. So it is a great moment to cherish his legacy. And moving forward, Kalidasa says, Tasya sthitva kathamapi puraha Kautugadhana hetoho antarbashpaha chiram anucharaha raja rajasya dadhyo meghaloke bhavati sukhino pyanyatha vritti chetaha kanthashlesha pranayini jane kimpunar dura samsthe. So Kalidasa applies 2 epithets to the Yaksha here. He says he is antarbashpa. He has grown so tired of crying all the time because of his separation from his beloved that he is not able to cry anymore. He is antarbashpa. He is suppressing his tears. That is one way to explain it. And the other way to it, you do not cry in front of a guest, especially a guest in front of whom, if it is a genuine request, you do not want to appease him by means of your tears. You do not want to use your tears as a bait, as to explain to him your position. It shows on its own accord. You do not want any other external means to substantiate your position. So Antarbashpaha Chiramanucharaha Rajarajasya Dadhyo, and he says Kathamapi Puraha Kautuka Dhana Hetoho. In front of the cloud, which is, engendering in the mind of Yaksha so many thoughts, so many Viprakirana bhavas, that the Yaksha is not at all able to stand firmly. He has somehow gotten himself to stand before the cloud. Kathamapi, Kalidasa says. So Kalidasa does not use nipatas, cha, vai, tuhi, to fill up verses just for the sake of chandas, just because Mandakranta is a difficult meter to handle. He does not use superfluous words. He uses words in their he uses words which are pregnant with meaning, which have so much vyanjakata in them. So he says Kathamapi Puraha, and he gives a very beautiful Arthantaranyasa. He says Meghaloke bhavati sukhino api anyatha vritti chetaha. While looking at a cloud, even for a person who is in a happy state of mind, he will be afflicted by some sort of ill thoughts, some sort of melancholy or some sort of wistfulness takes over the person, even for a moment, even temporarily. He will be, disturbed somehow. So if this is the case with a person who is in a happy state of mind, what to speak of a person who is afflicted by love, who is, suffering separation from his beloved? That is what Kalidasa says. Kanthashlesha pranayini jane kimpunar dura samsthe. The way in which Kalidasa has expressed this is also by itself very beautiful. He says, Kimpunaha, Kimpunar dura samsthe. It is like the poet talking to us. If the poet had, merely narrated it, he would not have said Kimpunaha. It is like he is having an intimate conversation with his readers. So he is trying to appeal to us of his ideas about his poetic creation. That is how he says. And going forward, he says, Pratyasanne nabhasi daita jivita lambanarthi. So the Yaksha, who was in the first verse of Meghadoota, he was described as Kami, Kaschit Kanta Virahaguruna Swadhikarat Pramattaha. He was described as a Kami, and here, because of his refinement that he has undergone for 8 months, he is Daita Jivita Lambanarthi. He is alive only for the reason to support his beloved when he unites with her. That is the sole purpose, that is the sole objective of his life at this point in time. So he is termed Daita Jivita Lambanarthi. So Nabhasi, in the month of Shravana, Jimutena Swakushalamayim Harayishyan Pravrittim Sapratyagreh Kutaja Kusumeh Kalpitarghaya Tasmai Pritaha Priti Pramukhavachanam Swagatam Vyajahara. So when he sees the cloud, he uses some flowers that he could use in his atmospheres, wild jasmines, Kutaja Kusumaihi. He uses them, and he welcomes the cloud by using them. He does not welcome it empty-handed, and he does not have anything. As I mentioned before, he does not have gold coins or a set of pearls to offer to the cloud. And also, that is a seasonal flower. The jasmine, that is the beauty of Kalidasa, the wild jasmine or any other flower that Kalidasa describes as blooming in the whole course of Meghadoota, are seasonal flowers. That is Kalidasa's, minute observation of nature. So that is how he says, Sapratyagraihi, fresh flowers, which are freshly bloomed. So just because he is in a state of absolute penury, he does not settle for something bad. He could have as well given flowers, or he could have, taken a blade of darbha grass and thrown at the cloud. He does not do that. He says he takes freshly bloomed flowers and offers it to the cloud. And Pritaha, he is happy. Priti Pramukha Vachanam. He talks to the cloud in a manner that is appealing to the cloud. He talks to it in a friendly manner. Swagatam Vyajahara. He says he welcomes it. So how does he welcome the cloud? What does the cloud do? We will see that in further talks. Thank you. Thanks for listening.